The padlocked doors of Soul Kitchen stood dark in the Portland rain. Taylor froze, her cafe now a hollow shell. Just yesterday it welcomed customers. Her phone buzzed. Mark's smug voice on the voicemail, taunting her defeat. Her eyes caught her grandmother's portrait inside, unreachable behind the glass. Numbness turned to resolve. Mark wouldn't take her heritage without a fight. A black umbrella appeared above her. A woman in a crisp suit spoke. "Taylor Jones? I'm Diana Ramirez. I specialize in small business fraud. We need to talk about Mark." Taylor sat in her empty apartment, staring at the photograph of her grandmother. The edges were worn from years of handling, the colors slightly faded, but the warm smile remained as vibrant as ever. Her fingers traced the outline of the woman who had taught her everything about perseverance, about creating something from nothing. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that everything her grandmother had inspired her to build was now gone. Her cafe, Soul Kitchen, had been stolen from her in the most devastating way possible. Just 24 hours ago, Taylor Jones had been the proud owner of Portland's most beloved community cafe, the place where local musicians found their first audience, where students could study for hours over a single cup of coffee, where she had created not just a business, but a sanctuary. 5 years of blood, sweat, and tears poured into those walls, into the recipes passed down from her grandmother, into the unique atmosphere that couldn't be replicated by corporate chains. 5 years of proving everyone wrong who said a woman like her couldn't succeed in this industry. The memories washed over her like a tidal wave. The day she signed the lease with Mark Foster beside her, both of them grinning with excitement and ambition. He had approached her after trying her homemade pastries at a community fair, offering to help turn her talent into a business. With his business experience and her culinary skills, they had seemed like the perfect partnership. Mark had handled the paperwork, the finances, the legal aspects, while Taylor created the heart and soul of Soul Kitchen. The rain outside her window matched her mood, relentless and gray. She hadn't slept since finding the doors to her cafe chained shut yesterday morning, a formal eviction notice taped to the window like an obituary. The shock had paralyzed her, standing there in the downpour, unable to comprehend how this could happen without any warning. That's when Diana had appeared beside her, offering her umbrella and introducing herself as a lawyer who specialized in small business fraud. At first, Taylor had been suspicious, but something in Diana's eyes, a fierce determination, had convinced her to listen. Together they had pieced together what happened. Mark had been systematically transferring assets into his name for months, creating a paper trail that made it appear Taylor was merely an employee rather than co-owner. He had used her trust against her, having her sign documents she didn't fully read during their busiest season. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife, twisting in her gut every time she thought about how she had considered him not just a partner, but a friend. Taylor placed the photograph back on the empty shelf, the only decoration in her Spartan apartment. She had poured everything into the cafe, living modestly to ensure the business thrived. Now she faced not just the loss of her livelihood, but the erasure of her legacy, of the dream she had promised her grandmother she would fulfill before she passed away. The sudden ping of her phone broke the silence, a message from Diana. Taylor reached for it, exhaustion making her movements slow and deliberate. As she read the text, her breath caught in her throat. Diana had been examining the documents Mark had used to claim sole ownership, and discovered a signature on a critical transfer agreement that didn't match Taylor's usual handwriting. It was similar enough to pass a casual inspection, but different in key ways that suggested forgery. The realization hit Taylor like an electric shock. This wasn't just betrayal. It was criminal. For the first time since she saw those chains on her cafe door, Taylor felt something other than despair. A tiny spark of hope flickered to life, fueled by something darker, more potent. Justice. Or perhaps revenge. Either way, Mark Foster had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Taylor stood across the street from the gleaming 30-story office building, her gaze fixed on the 12th floor windows where light spilled out into the evening darkness. Through the glass, she could see the silhouettes of people raising glasses, laughing, celebrating. Among them was Mark Foster, the man who had stolen everything from her. He wore an expensive new suit, his arm casually draped over the shoulder of a potential investor as he gestured animatedly with his free hand. Not a care in the world, not a single thought about the lives he had affected. The rain had finally stopped, but Taylor felt cold to her core as she watched the celebration of her own demise. The past week had been a blur of legal terminology, bureaucratic offices, and countless dead ends. Diana had been relentless, guiding Taylor through the process of fighting back, but at every turn, they found Mark had already been there. He had spoken to the right people, filed the correct paperwork, created a narrative where Taylor was merely a disgruntled employee, trying to claim ownership of something that was never hers. It was meticulous, calculated, and devastatingly effective. They had visited 3 different offices in the Portland courthouse that morning alone. Each clerk had reviewed their documentation with increasingly skeptical eyes, pointing out the numerous signatures Taylor had apparently provided over the years, gradually signing away her rights to the business. Diana had argued about the suspicious pattern, about the forgery they suspected, but without more concrete evidence, they were simply 2 women making accusations against a respected businessman who had all his paperwork in perfect order. The property management company that owned the building where Soul Kitchen had operated for 5 years refused to even meet with them. Mark had shown them a contract, signed by Taylor, that transferred the lease entirely to him 6 months ago. The fact that she had continued working there was, in their eyes, merely an arrangement between her and Mark that had apparently ended. Taylor's bank accounts told an even grimmer story. The business account had been systematically drained over 3 months, with legitimate-looking transfers approved with her digital signature. The small personal savings she had built up was barely enough to cover another month of rent on her apartment. Mark had not only taken her business, but had positioned her for complete financial ruin. Diana had tried to find allies among Mark's former business associates, but they either refused to speak or provided vague, non-committal responses. It was clear Mark Foster was not a man who left loose ends. His reputation in Portland's business community was pristine, built on careful networking and strategic relationships with influential people. Against his word, Taylor's claims seemed like the desperate flailing of a failed entrepreneur. As the night grew darker, Taylor finally turned away from the building. Diana had warned her not to confront Mark directly, that it would only weaken their position and potentially expose their strategy. But standing there, watching him celebrate while her life crumbled, tested every ounce of her restraint. She had built Soul Kitchen from nothing, named it after her grandmother's kitchen where she learned to bake, decorated it with family photographs and heirlooms. It wasn't just a business. It was her heritage, her identity, the culmination of 3 generations of women who had fought against overwhelming odds. The walk back to her apartment took 40 minutes, but Taylor barely noticed the distance. Her mind raced through possibilities, through memories, through the warning signs she should have seen but chose to ignore. Mark's insistence on handling all the paperwork, his gentle discouragements when she wanted to learn more about the business side, the way he scheduled important meetings when he knew she would be busiest in the kitchen. It had all seemed like he was shouldering burdens to help her focus on what she loved most. In reality, he had been meticulously constructing her downfall. The stairwell to her 3rd-floor apartment was dimly lit as usual, the bulb on the 2nd floor still flickering despite multiple complaints to the landlord. Taylor climbed slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. As she reached her door, she noticed something was different. A small white note had been taped to it, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft from the old windows at the end of the hallway. Taylor approached cautiously, a sense of unease growing as she got closer. She pulled the note from the door, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The message was short, typed in plain black letters on white paper. No signature, no indication of who had left it. Just 5 words that sent ice through her veins. Stop now, before it worsens. Taylor frantically tore through the kitchen cabinets of her apartment, pulling out stacks of old mail, forgotten recipe notebooks, and stray papers that had accumulated over 5 years of building her business. Desperation drove her movements as she tossed items aside, crawled under tables, and climbed on chairs to reach the highest shelves. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill in the poorly heated apartment. 3 days had passed since the threatening note appeared on her door, and with each passing hour, the walls seemed to close in a little more. She needed something, Anything that could prove her rightful ownership of Soul Kitchen before Mark erased every trace of her connection to the cafe she had built with her heart and soul. The apartment that had once felt like a temporary sacrifice, a small space she endured while pouring all her resources into the business, now felt like a prison of her own making. The minimal furniture, the lack of decoration, the general austerity of her living conditions, all stood as stark reminders of how completely she had committed to her dream, only to have it stolen through betrayal and deception. A dream that was slipping further away with each failed attempt to fight back through official channels. Diana had been direct with her that morning. Without additional evidence, their chances of legally reclaiming the cafe were diminishing rapidly. Mark's documentation was comprehensive, his forgeries skilled enough to pass initial scrutiny, and his connections in the local business community created a wall of credibility that was proving nearly impossible to penetrate. Time was running out, and Taylor knew it. The small amount of savings she had left would barely cover another 2 weeks of expenses. After that, she faced not just the loss of her business, but potential homelessness. A stack of old catalogs fell from the top shelf, raining down and scattering across the kitchen floor. Taylor cursed under her breath, frustration and exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. As she knelt to gather the fallen papers, her hand brushed against something solid that had fallen behind the small refrigerator. Curious, she reached further back, her fingers closing around a hard rectangular object. Pulling it out, she found herself holding her old cell phone, the one she had replaced almost a year ago when the screen cracked after a particularly hectic day at the cafe. Taylor sat back on her heels, staring at the forgotten device. She remembered setting it aside, meaning to transfer some photos from it, but in the chaos of running the business, it had been forgotten. With trembling fingers, she pressed the power button, surprised when the screen flickered to life, the battery somehow still holding a charge. She navigated to the voice recorder app, where she had often recorded recipe ideas while working. Scrolling through the old files, her breath suddenly caught in her throat. There, dated from 14 months ago, was a recording titled, "Meeting with Mark, Partnership Agreement." Taylor's heart raced as she pressed play. The sound quality was poor, the recorder having been placed in her apron pocket during the meeting, but the voices were clear enough. Mark's smooth, confident tone as he walked her through what he had described as standard partnership documents that would protect both their interests in Soul Kitchen. Her own voice asking questions, his reassurances, the specific promises he made about their equal ownership and profit-sharing arrangement. Most importantly, his clear acknowledgement that Soul Kitchen was her creation, her concept, her recipes. He was merely providing business expertise and initial capital as an equal partner, not the sole owner. Taylor played the recording 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Not from despair this time, but from a surging sense of validation and hope. She immediately called Diana, her voice shaking with excitement as she explained her discovery. Diana's measured response was cautiously optimistic. The recording was definitely useful, but on its own, it might not be enough to counter the paper trail Mark had created. They needed more. Bank statements, text messages, emails, anything that could support the narrative of their partnership and contradict the story Mark had fabricated. Inspired by the discovery, Taylor spent the next several hours scouring her apartment with renewed purpose, gathering every scrap of paper, every digital communication she could find related to Soul Kitchen and her partnership with Mark. She found old emails on her laptop, text message exchanges partially backed up to her cloud account, photos from the cafe's opening day showing her and Mark cutting the ribbon together, while local news outlets covered the event. Piece by piece, a counter-narrative began to emerge, fragmented, incomplete, but present. As Taylor organized the evidence on her small dining table, her phone buzzed with an incoming message from Diana. The lawyer had been doing some investigating of her own and had discovered something alarming. Mark wasn't just taking over Soul Kitchen. He was already in negotiations to sell it to Horizon Foods, a corporate chain that specialized in purchasing successful independent eateries, stripping them of their unique character, and transforming them into standardized, efficient profit centers. The sale was scheduled to finalize in just 2 weeks. The realization hit Taylor like a physical blow. Mark wasn't just stealing her business. He was preparing to erase it completely. The recipes her grandmother had passed down, the community space she had cultivated, the unique atmosphere that had made Soul Kitchen a beloved Portland institution, all of it would be demolished, replaced by corporate efficiency and standardized menu items. The very soul of Soul Kitchen would be extinguished, as if she had never existed, never poured her heritage and identity into those walls. As the implications sank in, Taylor felt a new emotion rising through her exhaustion and fear, a cold, clarifying anger that crystallized into absolute determination. This was no longer just about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. This was about preserving the legacy her grandmother had entrusted to her, about honoring the community that had embraced her vision. Mark Foster had underestimated her once. He wouldn't have the opportunity to make that mistake again. Taylor sat alone on a weathered bench in Peninsula Park, watching children chase each other across the playground with carefree abandon. The early autumn sunshine filtered through the changing leaves, creating dappled patterns on the ground that shifted with the gentle breeze. She had been coming to this park since her first days in Portland, finding solace in its quiet corners when the pressure of building her business became overwhelming. Now she returned for a different reason, to contemplate what remained of her future, to gather strength from the simple joy of others before deciding her next move. 10 days had passed since she discovered the voice recording. 10 days of legal consultations, of gathering evidence, of hitting walls that seemed insurmountable. Despite their growing collection of contradictory evidence, Diana had been honest about their chances. Mark's paper trail was meticulous. His connections within the Portland business community ran deep. The system seemed designed to protect people like him. People with resources, with networks, with the power to shape narratives and influence perceptions. The sale to Horizon Foods was progressing rapidly, scheduled to close in just 4 more days. A little girl, perhaps 5 years old, squealed with delight as she zoomed down the slide, her braided hair flying behind her. Taylor watched her run back to the ladder for another turn, her enthusiasm undimmed by repetition. There was something about the child's persistence that resonated deep within Taylor's chest. How many times had she herself gotten back up, tried again, persevered through doubts and setbacks? She had grown up watching her grandmother do the same, turning nothing into something through sheer force of will and unwavering belief in her own worth. The vibration of her phone interrupted her thoughts. Diana was calling. Taylor answered, listening intently as the lawyer outlined a strategy that had been forming in her mind. The legal routes were proving difficult, Diana explained, but there were other avenues they hadn't fully explored. The courts might be influenced by Mark's connections, but public opinion followed different rules. Soul Kitchen wasn't just Taylor's business, it was a community institution. The people who had gathered there daily, who had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries within its walls, who had found comfort in its atmosphere during difficult times, they were stakeholders too, even if no legal document acknowledged that fact. Diana's proposal was bold, perhaps even risky. They would take their fight public, use social media, local news outlets, and the community itself to tell Taylor's story. Show the real human cost behind Mark's corporate machinations. Create enough public pressure that Horizon Foods might reconsider the reputational risk of proceeding with the purchase. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, Diana cautioned, but it offered a path forward when all others seemed blocked. Taylor ended the call, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. Going public meant exposure, vulnerability. It meant putting her story, her pain, her failure to protect her business on display for everyone to see. It meant potentially angering Mark further, provoking retaliation beyond the threatening note on her door. But as she watched the children play, fearless in their pursuit of joy, she felt something harden within her. Fear had never been part of her grandmother's legacy. It wouldn't be part of hers either. That evening, from the small desk squeezed into the corner of her apartment, Taylor began to tell her story. She started with a simple post on her personal social media accounts, a photograph of Soul Kitchen on its opening day, her grandmother's recipe book visible on the counter, Mark standing beside her with his arm around her shoulders. The caption was straightforward, honest, devoid of melodrama, but rich with emotion. The truth about what had happened, about the theft of not just a business but a heritage, about the imminent erasure of a community space by corporate interests. She ended with a simple request. Share this story. Speak up if Soul Kitchen mattered to you. Help preserve what we built together. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By midnight, her post had been shared hundreds of times. By morning, local food bloggers had picked up the story. Former customers posted their own photographs and memories of Soul Kitchen, tagging local news outlets, demanding investigation. Online reviews for Mark's other business ventures began to reflect awareness of the controversy. A food critic who had given Soul Kitchen its first positive review wrote a scathing article questioning the ethics of Horizon Foods' acquisition practices. Diana helped Taylor organize the growing movement, setting up a formal social media campaign, creating a simple website that detailed the evidence they had gathered, establishing a timeline of events that clarified the systematic nature of Mark's deception. They were careful to present facts rather than accusations, to focus on preserving Soul Kitchen rather than vilifying Mark, though the implications were clear enough. The strategy was working. Local television stations reached out for interviews, community leaders expressed concern, and longtime customers organized a peaceful gathering outside the now-shuttered café, sharing memories and recipes inspired by Taylor's menu. 3 days into their campaign, as Taylor finished a phone interview with a regional newspaper, Diana arrived at her apartment with unexpected news. A woman named Jessica Chen wanted to meet with them. She had been Mark's executive assistant for 2 years, including during the period when many of the questionable documents had been created and filed. She had left the position 3 months ago, and had been following the unfolding story of Soul Kitchen with growing concern. She had information, she claimed, that could substantiate Taylor's allegations of forgery and fraud. Taylor felt her heart race as Diana explained the potential significance of this development. An insider witness, someone with direct knowledge of Mark's business practices, could transform their case from a disputed narrative into documented wrongdoing. The meeting was arranged for that evening at Diana's office, away from prying eyes and potential interference. As Taylor prepared to leave for this crucial encounter, she paused at her grandmother's photograph, touching it briefly for strength. For the first time since finding her cafe doors chained shut, she allowed herself to fully embrace the possibility that this fight might not be lost after all. Jessica Chen's testimony could be the key that unlocked her future. A future where Soul Kitchen might once again open its doors, where her grandmother's legacy could continue to nurture a community that had rallied to defend it when all seemed lost. The path forward was still uncertain, fraught with obstacles and risks, but Taylor was no longer walking it alone. Taylor smiled for the first time in weeks as she scrolled through her phone, reading messages of support that continued to pour in from across Portland and beyond. The community's response had transformed from a trickle to a flood, washing away her isolation and replacing it with a network of voices demanding justice. Local artists had created protest posters featuring stylized images of Soul Kitchen. A popular band that had performed their first show at the cafe released a song called Soul Revival, with proceeds dedicated to Taylor's legal fund. 3 other small business owners had come forward with similar stories about Mark, though none had been as systematically deceived. The hashtag, #SaveSoulKitchen, trended locally, catching the attention of regional news outlets, and even a national blog focused on corporate ethics and community businesses. But it was Jessica Chen's testimony that had truly changed the game. The former executive assistant had arrived at Diana's office that evening with a leather portfolio filled with evidence of Mark's methods, copies of emails where he instructed her to mimic Taylor's signature on critical documents, screenshots of calendar entries marking when certain transfers should occur, timed specifically when Taylor would be busiest in the kitchen and least likely to check financial records. Most damning of all, a recorded conversation where Mark openly discussed with a colleague how he was systematically removing Taylor from the business, referring to her as talent, who had served her purpose in establishing the cafe's reputation. Jessica had gathered these materials in her final months working for Mark, increasingly uncomfortable with his tactics but fearful of confronting him directly. When she saw Taylor's story emerging online, she knew it was time to come forward. Armed with this new evidence, Diana had moved quickly. Rather than returning to the courts immediately, she arranged a meeting with Horizon Foods' legal representatives, presenting the evidence and outlining the potential reputational damage of proceeding with the acquisition of a business obtained through documented fraud. Simultaneously, she contacted the district attorney's office, formally reporting the forgery and fraud while providing Jessica's testimony and supporting evidence. The threat of criminal charges combined with public pressure created a perfect storm that threatened to engulf not just Mark, but anyone who continued to do business with him. Now, 2 days later, Taylor sat across from Diana at an upscale cafe in downtown Portland, neutral territory chosen for a critical negotiation. Mark would be arriving with his attorney in 15 minutes. The terms of engagement had been carefully established. This was a settlement discussion, not an admission of guilt. No recordings, no press, just the four of them attempting to resolve the situation before formal charges were filed and civil litigation commenced. Taylor smoothed down her dress, a simple but elegant burgundy number she had purchased specifically for this meeting, wanting to project the confidence and professionalism that Mark had once used to undermine her. Diana reviewed their strategy one final time, her voice low and measured despite the nearly empty cafe. They had leverage now, substantial leverage, but Mark remained dangerous. His reputation was crumbling, his deal with Horizon Foods suspended pending investigation, but cornered predators were often at their most vicious. They needed to be prepared for anything from humble capitulation to aggressive counter-accusations. Taylor nodded, absorbing the advice while maintaining her outward calm. Inside, her heart raced with a complex mixture of anxiety, anticipation, and something like exhilaration. After weeks of feeling powerless, of having her life and legacy systematically dismantled, she was finally reclaiming her agency, her voice, her right to fight for what she had built. The cafe door opened, and Mark entered with his attorney, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit and stern expression telegraphed decades of corporate legal battles. Mark himself looked different than Taylor remembered. His usual confidence dimmed, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights, his typically immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of strain. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Taylor held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away or show weakness. This was not the broken, desperate woman who had stood in the rain staring at chained doors. This was Taylor Jones, rightful owner of Soul Kitchen, supported by her community and armed with truth. The negotiation lasted nearly 3 hours, moving from tense initial posturing through heated exchanges to eventually reach a tentative framework for resolution. Mark's attorney began with flat denials and implications that Jessica's evidence had been obtained illegally. Diana countered with detailed documentation and the reminder that criminal charges would render such technicalities irrelevant. The conversation shifted gradually from if there would be a settlement to what that settlement would entail. Mark, initially silent and stone-faced, became increasingly engaged as it became clear that his options were narrowing to varying degrees of surrender rather than victory. By the session's end, the broad strokes of an agreement had emerged. Soul Kitchen would be returned to Taylor's full ownership. Financial compensation would be provided for lost revenue and damages. Mark would dissolve their partnership entirely, relinquishing any claim to the business, its recipes, or its brand. In exchange, Taylor would not press criminal charges, though she would not prevent others from doing so should the district attorney decide to proceed independently. A non-disclosure agreement would cover the specific terms of the settlement, but not the fact that ownership was being restored to Taylor. As the meeting concluded and hands were formally shaken, Mark finally addressed Taylor directly. His voice was low, controlled, but unable to fully mask the bitterness of defeat. He suggested that her victory was merely good fortune, the lucky intervention of a disgruntled former employee combined with sentimental public support. That in the real business world, her approach to Soul Kitchen would always be vulnerable because she prioritized community over profit, emotion over strategy. He finished by offering her a deal. He would buy the cafe outright, at twice its market value, allowing her to walk away wealthy and unburdened by the inevitable struggles of keeping an independent business afloat in an increasingly corporate landscape. Taylor listened without interruption, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. When Mark finished, the cafe fell silent, his attorney looking uncomfortable, Diana watchful and ready to intervene. The moment stretched between them, filled with the weight of their shared history, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed everything Taylor had built, and the unexpected path that had led to this confrontation. Finally, Taylor leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and unwavering as she delivered her response. A response that would determine not just the fate of Soul Kitchen, but the trajectory of her own future, and the message she would send to everyone who had supported her fight against seemingly insurmountable odds. Taylor stood before the locked doors of Soul Kitchen, keys clutched tightly in her hand, the morning sun warming her shoulders. 3 months had passed since that pivotal meeting with Mark. 3 months of legal paperwork, restoration work, and careful planning. The cafe's exterior had been refreshed with a new coat of deep purple paint, but the hand-painted sign remained the same, a tribute to her grandmother's kitchen where Taylor had first learned the power of food to build community. She took a deep breath, savoring this moment of stillness before everything changed again. She had rejected Mark's offer without hesitation that day in the cafe. His attempt to put a price tag on her dreams, to suggest that her values were a weakness rather than her greatest strength, had only crystallized her resolve. Taylor had built Soul Kitchen as more than a business. It was a living embodiment of her heritage, her vision for what a community space could be. Selling it for any amount would have meant surrendering not just a building or a brand, but a piece of her very identity. The look of surprise on Mark's face when she declined his offer had been brief but unmistakable. Another reminder that he had never truly understood what motivated her, what made Soul Kitchen special. The settlement had proceeded according to the framework established that day. Soul Kitchen returned to Taylor's ownership. Compensation provided for the weeks of lost revenue. The partnership dissolved completely, with Mark signing away any claim to the business or its future profits. The district attorney's office had ultimately decided to pursue charges against Mark for the documented forgeries, but that process was proceeding independently of Taylor's restoration efforts. Last she had heard, Mark had left Portland, his reputation in the local business community irreparably damaged by the combination of legal troubles and public exposure. Behind Taylor, the small crowd of supporters grew steadily larger as the reopening time approached. Many were regular customers who had frequented Soul Kitchen before the closure, people who had shared their stories online and participated in the campaign to save the cafe. Others were new faces, drawn by the publicity surrounding Taylor's fight and victory. Local news crews had set up across the street, cameras ready to document the triumphant return of a beloved community institution. A small jazz trio, musicians who had often performed at Soul Kitchen's weekend brunches, set up their instruments nearby, providing a soundtrack of gentle anticipation. Diana arrived just minutes before the scheduled opening, looking polished and professional as always, but with an undisguised excitement in her eyes. What had begun as an unexpected professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship over the months of struggle and eventual victory. The lawyer had gone far beyond her professional obligations, becoming Taylor's strategist, advocate, and confidant through the darkest moments of uncertainty. Now she stood at Taylor's side, a symbol of the unexpected alliances that had emerged from adversity. Inside, everything was ready. The vintage tables had been arranged exactly as before, though now each featured a small vase of fresh flowers donated by a local florist who had been vocal in the #SaveSoulKitchen campaign. The menu had been updated but remained true to Taylor's original vision. Comfort food elevated through careful technique and quality ingredients, with her grandmother's signature dishes given pride of place. The kitchen gleamed with newly polished equipment, and Taylor's trusted former staff had all returned, eager to be part of Soul Kitchen's resurrection. But the reopening represented more than just a return to business as usual. During the renovation period, Taylor had transformed the cafe's small back office into a consultation space where she would offer free monthly workshops for women entrepreneurs, particularly those from underserved communities. The first session was already fully booked, with topics covering everything from business plan development to navigating partnership agreements, hard-won knowledge Taylor was determined to share. A portion of each month's profits would be directed to a scholarship fund for culinary students, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent talented young chefs from pursuing their dreams. As the clock struck 10, Taylor finally inserted the key into the lock. The tumblers turned smoothly, the door swinging open to reveal the warm, inviting interior of Soul Kitchen reborn. The waiting crowd erupted in applause, camera flashes captured the moment, and the jazz trio launched into a celebratory tune. Taylor stepped across the threshold, emotion tightening her throat as she welcomed everyone back to the space that had nearly been lost forever. The reopening day unfolded in a blur of joyful moments. The kitchen hummed with efficient energy, serving signature dishes to eager patrons. Conversations and laughter filled every corner, the atmosphere electric with the shared understanding that this was more than just a cafe reopening. It was a testament to the power of community, to the refusal to surrender in the face of injustice. Taylor moved through it all, greeting customers, expediting orders, sharing embraces with supporters who had become friends through their shared battle. Late in the afternoon, during a rare quiet moment, Taylor retreated to the kitchen for a breath of solitude. As she leaned against the counter, her gaze fell on her grandmother's recipe book, now displayed in a custom-built glass case on the wall, both functional reference and honored artifact. Beside it hung a framed photograph of the woman who had inspired it all, smiling with the quiet confidence that Taylor had inherited. In that moment of reflection, surrounded by the business she had built twice now, Taylor felt a profound sense of completion. She had not only reclaimed what was rightfully hers, but had transformed it into something stronger, more purposeful, more deeply connected to the community it served. The kitchen door swung open, and Diana entered with a small velvet box in her hand. She approached Taylor with a smile that contained both pride and a hint of mischief. Inside the box was a key, not to Soul Kitchen, but to the vacant storefront 2 doors down that had recently come on the market. Diana explained that several investors, impressed by Taylor's resilience and business acumen, were interested in funding an expansion. They envisioned not just a second Soul Kitchen location, but the beginning of a community-focused enterprise that could serve as a model for socially conscious business practices throughout Portland and beyond. The decision, Diana emphasized, was entirely Taylor's, with no pressure or deadline attached. Taylor closed the velvet box, holding it thoughtfully in her palm. Just 1 year ago, expansion had been a distant dream, something she and Mark had occasionally discussed but never seriously pursued. Now it was a tangible possibility, offered on her terms, aligned with her values, supported by people who understood what Soul Kitchen truly represented. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice after all. As evening fell and the day's success became undeniable, Taylor gathered her staff for a toast before the dinner service began. Raising a glass of sparkling cider, she thanked them for their loyalty, their talent, and their belief in Soul Kitchen's mission. She acknowledged the difficult journey they had weathered together and the uncertain path that still lay ahead. Building something meaningful was never easy, she reminded them, but it was always worthwhile. The glasses clinked together in agreement, a chorus of commitment to the values that had survived betrayal, legal battles, and the very real threat of erasure. Soul Kitchen had been saved, but more importantly, its soul remained intact, hardened by fire, strengthened by community, and now positioned to grow in ways its founder had only begun to imagine.